Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? There's a really important thing that I learned from role-playing games, from being in recovery, and from being in rock bands. And that is that people can be very, very different. They may seem the same on the surface, or it may seem like we all want the same thing, and it may seem really obvious that you should see the world or the situation in a particular way, but it turns out we want very different things, and we see the world in a very different way. And this can lead to a lot of confusion unless you start to accept that people are different and that your way isn't the only way to look at something. And even if you still agree with yourself, which I often do, at least I can understand and respect the other perspectives that the other people have. And, very often we think we're talking about the same thing, but on closer examination, we're not. RPGs are a great example of this simply because the hobby is still in its infancy. It, arguably started sometime in the 70s, but it's still a young hobby. Because of that, one of the things that we still lack as a community is an agreed upon lexicon and a set of definitions and terms, and to describe the play experience. We try, but very often we don't even agree on the definition of the words, which can lead us to a lot of problems. And I'll use myself as an example. When I started playing, I played in a certain way. As time went on, I started to believe this. Well, this is the correct way to play. This makes the most sense, doesn't it? Why would you play a different way? I don't understand what these other people are doing. The older I got, the more I listened, the more I learned, the more I started to realize that there were more intentions for playing than made sense to me or that I would even think of. And these other people weren't crazy. They just wanted a different experience. And I started to learn that there were so many other different intentions for playing and ways to play. And I started to accept that the hobby is much, much bigger than I thought it was. And because of that, very often I was going to have to look to find the people that wanted to play the way that I did. And very often what I found is they might live on a different continent. And fortunately, things like Zoom make it much easier for us to have these game groups where we are able to find the people that that fit with us and that share our aesthetic. And I have some great game groups now, but still they're not 100% perfect because we all don't all completely match up with each other. But it's a lot better than it was. And this really isn't all that different than being in a rock band. We all come with different influences, with different experiences, with different styles of playing, with different conceptions of where does our instrument fit in the mix and how do we best support a song. And when we're playing a song, what was the best thing we should do here? What should this person be doing? And unless we have a dictator, what it ends up being is this fusion of all the different people in the band. And as we play, it starts to, become more and more of this cohesive unit. And we start to figure out where we all fit. But you couldn't, none of us could actually design that. Now, occasionally you play in a dictatorship. And sometimes there are some people that really have, they're really good songwriters. They really have a good sense for how things should be done and how things should be played. But even in a case like that, if you're a seasoned musician, if you know what you're doing, you can make their song better by the way you play, by the way you approach the bass line or the drum, the drum feel and all that kind of stuff, and the drum parts, I suppose I should say. And, we can still have that fusion. It's just a little bit different because we're dealing with a dominant personality. But very often we can have very different, we discover when we get together a group of people, we have very different intentions for what we're doing. And sometimes we find out the grouping doesn't work and life goes on. We also find this in recovery, and very often in recovery service work. All of us in there, we have the same goal. We want to help the addict that still suffers. And so that's the prime importance for us. But very often, we have different ideas about the best way to do that. And then sometimes these things can even be in something like a budget and how we allocate resources or what time a meeting should open. And very often, we find that there are some hard-headed people involved in service work, people that feel very strongly about what they're doing, but they disagree. And a lot of times we have to end up using group conscience. And the thing about group conscience is sometimes it doesn't go your way. And you go away from that meeting still shaking your head a bit. I've had that happen many, many times, but just trusting that at the end of the day, we all really want the same thing. We're just disagreeing about how to get there. And so it can be a little rough. And sometimes you start to realize there's certain people you don't want to serve with because you're never going to get over mismatches in intentions. And so it's kind of a live and learn. And honestly, you find this in just about any other area of life. I just happen to have learned it really well in these particular things, which show up in this channel an awful lot. And, my friend Anthony very often calls the alchemy of play when we get a group of people together in a role-playing game, and we're bringing these different things to the table, slightly different play styles. We interact with the imagined situation differently, and so none of us could really have determined what was finally going to emerge. And sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Sometimes it's a lot weirder than the sum of its parts. And so the actual idiom that shows up is, the sum of all these different parts. And so it becomes very much the alchemy of play. And that alchemy of play can apply to bands, can apply to service work, can apply to so many different things. Even the feel of a recovery meeting based upon the different people there and how they interact. And sometimes that's the best, because people that walk in off the street, they may not need the way that I approach recovery. They may need the way the person that's sitting next to me. And because of that mix of personalities and approaches in the group, we find there's somebody for everybody. So those mixes sometimes can be really, really important. If we all thought the same way, it might appeal to some people, but not to others. And we don't want to, lose people that way, or have them, still suffer from addiction because we were just all so rigid and dogmatic, if you know what I mean. Learning to navigate group dynamics is a skill that you and I need to learn in life. It's something that I've definitely had to learn, sometimes the hard way. And, sometimes the people that you disliked at first become your closest friends, and the people that you originally were close to, you drift apart after a while. So you never really know who's going to be with you for the long run. The paradox that I've discovered over and over again is that at the heart of things, people are all really the same. We all want the same basic things. We all have the same basic drives. We just disagree about how to get to them. But fundamentally, people are the same. And I've learned this in work, working with people of various different cultures as well. I had a real eye-opening experience, in my, late teens and early 20s, as I started to work with people from various ethnicities and backgrounds, and discovered we're all the same. We all care about the same things. However, the paradox is that very often we all want to go about these things in very different ways, and sometimes we don't understand each other. And so we're all very different at the same time. Life was not going to be easy, kids. I don't know if anybody told you it is or was going to be that way, but they lied to you. So clarity is essential, especially in things like recovery, service work, but anything that we're doing, because assumptions can lead to frustration in a band, in an RPG session, in a recovery service meeting, whatever it happens to be, in your job. And I can struggle with this sometimes, because as an INTJ, I'm trying not to choke, as an INTJ, somebody that's really logical, very often I struggle because people don't see what's blindingly obvious to me. And it gets very, very frustrating. And it can be in a role-playing game situation, it can be like where some of us are just there to have the experience of the character and of the situation, and other people are really, really pushing towards the story and producing a story, and pushing things or making decisions out of character, and they don't even see it. And it's hard to get them to see that they're doing things that's out of character, where there might be this mismatch. And it's blindingly obvious to me. I can see it happening in real time. Sometimes in bands, it's very obviously when we get to a gig that we should, use the PA this way, or we need to have this kind of volume, or, based on this crowd, we should really tailor the set list this way, or whatever it happens to be. And, they would just let me be the band dictator. But very often sometimes the band leader doesn't agree. And, I don't understand why they don't see things that are just blindingly obvious. Like, we shouldn't take a break now. That sort of thing. And in recovery meetings, it could be something as simple as a budget, where I see that we have budgetary items coming up in the near future, so we need to save some money, and they're gung-ho about fund flowing to the next level of the service chain. And I'm like, oh, I think it's a bad idea. And they just don't see it. And I don't understand it. So this can be frustrating because, no matter what you're bent, you're going to find out that people don't see the world and don't see the situation that way that you do. And sometimes you can be scratching your head. How can they not see this? Such is life, kids. You know, people can be so focused on their intentions or their ideals that they miss practical realities. And that is the cross that I have to bear as I watch people do that all the time. So the big lesson for me is like being right isn't enough. I have to understand. I have to listen. I have to be able to adapt. You know, I have to be able to observe, what people, not just what people are saying, but what they're doing, and understand sometimes that I'm not going to get my way and that I'm going to have to compromise, even though sometimes I think it's stupid. So whether it comes, whether it's in like RPGs, whether it's in recovery work or, in recovery rooms of recovery, whether it's in a rock band, it all boils down to learning how to play well with others, which is not always as easy as it sounds, but it's a skill that really serves me well and would probably serve you well as well. So have a good one, kids. I hope some of this made sense, but it makes sense to me because after all, I'm right, right?